Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this first panel session called New Mechanisms for Industry Academia Interactions, Successes and Obstacles. And I'm Michael Rosenblatt. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Merck. Every one of the panelists that I'll introduce in a moment has considerable experience working at the interface of academia and industry, and they have deep insights about that interface and what we need to do to advance science and medicine. It's clear just from the last beautiful lecture by Dr. Fogelstein that we appreciate more and more the complexity of human biology, and that success depends on making connections across disciplines and across sectors. And that's especially true if we're going to translate basic science research into new therapies, because translational research really never takes a straight path. So where will innovations come from? I think that the first step begins with opening the door to each other's ideas, and we need mechanisms that will foster exchange. And although I've spent time in both sectors, in academia and industry, I thought I would start by giving a little bit of the context of industry at this time. It's a challenging time in the pharmaceutical and biotech sector. The return on investments has decreased over the last 2 decades. I was in industry a little over 20 years ago, left for academia and returned, so I'm a little bit like Rip Van Winkle. And when I wake up again, the return on investment on average by a pharmaceutical industry 25 years ago was about 3 to 1 for their investment in R&D. The figures from just a couple of years ago show that that return is 83 cents. Now, I'm not the chief financial officer of Merck, but I know that that's not a good business proposition. One thing that hasn't changed is the length of time it takes to develop a new drug. Despite all these wonderful technologies, it still takes on the order of 15 years. If you compare that to an iPhone, a device that we're all in love with, a great invention, it's 3 to 4 times longer to invent a drug, and also much more expensive. In 2012, industry in the United States spent almost $50 billion on R&D. The NIH spent about $30 billion. That ratio is reversed from the 1990s, and a cause of grave concern for industry, this decline in NIH buying power. Nevertheless, partnerships between academia and industry are at an all-time high. But the arrangements are different. Industry no longer sends blank checks to academia. We now have formats that have joint steering committees, established milestones for progress. Sometimes academia is actually asked to have some skin in the game. So I would say that the landscape is changing very rapidly, and it's one that's currently stressed. So let me begin with the introductions of our panelists, and then we'll have a question to all of them. I'm going to begin at the far end with Chris Austin. He's the director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the NIH, also known as NCATS. This is a position he's held since September of 2012, when he was appointed by the NIH director, Francis Collins. NCATS is devoted to finding ways to speed the delivery of new drugs and diagnostics and medical devices to patients. Chris has been at the NIH since 2002. Before that, he spent some time in industry at Merck, working on genome-based discovery of targets and drugs. Next in the line is Mike Brown, who's the Moncrief Distinguished Chair in Cholesterol and Arteriosclerosis Research and the Regental Professor and Thomas Chair of Medicine. He's the director of the Johnson Center for Molecular Genetics at the University of Texas Southwestern. His research is in the genetics of human disease, mechanisms of vesicular transport in animal cells, and regulation of cholesterol metabolism. And as we all know, in 1985, together with Dr. Joe Goldstein, he shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on cholesterol metabolism. And it's fair to say that that work led directly to the development of statin drugs, which have gone on to save millions of lives. And much of that work spurred collaborations between academia, government, and industry. Next in the line is Rob Califf. Rob is the Vice Chancellor of Clinical and Translational Research and Director of the Duke Translational Medicine Institute. He's a professor of medicine and a cardiologist at Duke University Medical Center. He's also the editor of the American Heart Journal, and he's founded a Center for Education and Research on Therapeutics, CERTS, which is a public-private partnership focusing on research and education to advance and optimize the use of medical products. Finally, to my left is Dr. John Potts, who's the Jackson Distinguished Professor of Clinical Medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He began his career at the NIH and then a few years later moved to Harvard and the Mass General, where he became a leader in endocrinology and in medicine, particularly in the areas of calcium metabolism, parathyroid hormone, and bone disease. He's held major leadership positions there, including chairman of medicine at the Mass General and director of research there, and has been particularly creative in establishing partnerships between academia and industry. So you can see it's really quite an illustrious panel. And I'd like to start with a question that I'll ask each of them to address, and it has to do with the environment that we're operating in now. The NIH budget has clearly suffered over the last several years, but along with that, we see a growing interest in academia of collaborating with industry. Do we see this as perhaps an inadvertent silver lining in the cuts at NIH? And if that's true, what can we do to take advantage of this new interest in collaborating between academia and industry? And I think I'll just go in the order of the people that I introduced. So, Chris, would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, well, from where I sit, and I spend a lot of time talking to trainees, there is, I think, different from when I trained 30 years ago, there really is an interest in patient problems and the patient, that is health implications of the basic research that many of the trainees are doing. And I think that has led them to the places that do this, which are companies by and large. I think some of it, frankly, has a very practical aspect, however, which is that with the NIH funding levels being at historic lows, and if one is trying to run one's lab, one looks for every source of income, so and in that case, I have seen young people who feel like they have to reach out and essentially become a contract research organization, which is not so good for their career. But I think in general, it's a very positive development. What I find is that even though the desire is there, the knowledge gap and the expertise gap between an academically trained scientist or physician scientist, of which I was one before I went to Merck, is so great. The gap between academic knowledge and what it takes to actually develop an intervention and deploy it in people, that there's frequently even frequently either a knowledge or an impedance mismatch between the academic investigator and the company. And really, that impedance mismatch and that knowledge deficit was one of the main reasons that NCATS was founded.
Mike, are you seeing more interaction between academia and industry, and what can we do to make it durable?
Well, I think it's a two-edged sword, frankly. When our students ask me the difference between working in academia and working in industry, I tell them that in both cases it's like playing pool, pocket billiards. The only difference is that in industry you have to call which ball goes into which pocket. In academia, we smash away, and whichever ball goes into whichever pocket, we take full credit. So, but I think there's something precious about just smashing the balls into the pockets that we have to preserve. I mean, we just heard a magnificent lecture by Merck Vogelstein, who, as Roy said in his introduction, has been laser focused on eventually winning this war against cancer. And that's a fantastic thing. But a lot of that is based on people who were much removed from the clinical sphere. The original oncogene work was done by people who were interested in animal tumors that were caused by viruses, and there was a huge amount of criticism because human tumors aren't caused by viruses, so why do we care about SARC? And now that the NIH is collapsing, and the companies are only interested in things that lead directly to treatments, who's going to discover the next SARC? And I think that's we need to preserve curiosity-driven research in academia, and not I don't begrudge the fact that Joe Goldstein and I worked very closely with Merck during the development of statins. I think it's a fantastic thing for particularly physician scientists to do. But I hope we aren't squeezing out the people who are not so focused directly on therapy.
Mike, I'm going to return to question you about that a little bit later. But Rob, is it billiards in clinical research in the United States or globally?
Well, but before I launch into my diatribe here, let me just say I agree with Mike. We need to preserve what he described, which is a precious discovery-based science engine, which is in some ways unique to the United States, in my opinion. My job has mostly been taking the random shots in billiards and telling people at the end of the study that 95% of the time what they thought was going to work didn't work. But without taking those random shots, we're going to have nothing. And as I look at Europeans handing me things and Chinese handing me things, I think the American academic system is probably the best. And it's got to be preserved, and I'll be interested later in hearing Chris's view as to whether the NIH is collapsing, as Mike described it. I like that term to at least wake people up in the morning. But I think there's an equally large and maybe even larger gap right now in this other thing that's evolving, where we're frankly failing on a grand scale. And I'm working with many people in this room in drug development and public health, and that intersection. And at least 5 people came up to me today and said, we can't continue to do clinical trials. It's too expensive. It's too inefficient. We got to do these little trials in very small selected areas, and it's leading to a lack of investment in our biggest diseases at a time when we really need to do it. So, and it's playing out in public health because despite all the great advances of American academia, right now in the 18 most economically developed countries, we're 18th in almost every major health parameter in the United States. We're in last place, and that gap is accelerating. Women, for example, surviving to age 50, we are so far behind every other economically developed country. It's frightening, and people should really look at these statistics. But I would argue, listening to this amazing lecture, which it was just fun to hear it and even contemplate it. Another place we've really failed is early human studies, where it's so inefficient and expensive, and we have these meccas of academic centers with all this funding, try to work with industry doing a phase 1 clinical trial right now and ask the question, are we really exploiting the technologies that we have to come to the best biological understanding? The industry mostly is still stuck with project teams, letting contracts as if they were paper clips that were being bought. And academia is so inefficient and poorly prepared to deal with what we ought to know that we end up with this amazingly sort of mismatched system. Now, the savior of all this, I think, is going to be health IT and integrated health systems. We can get into that later. I think there really actually is a solution. And I can't finish without at least mentioning the Sunshine Act, which in my world, I don't know what the consequences are going to be when the websites get active, the press gets hot, those of you who saw 60 Minutes on Sunday, did anybody watch 60 Minutes? It was about Congress. And believe it or not, at a time when we can't get a cup of coffee when we interact with each other, in Congress it's legal to lend yourself money out of your campaign fund and then charge 18% interest to your campaign fund to pad your own pockets and to take your donors to St. Andrews and Pebble Beach on a regular basis, and it's perfectly okay. I'm all for transparency, but I think as a group, there's a risk that things could go very adverse in the near-term future unless we actively work together to make sure we do the right things in this transparency era.
Right. Well, Mike Brown says NIH might be collapsing. Rob says that America's falling behind in many ways in science, and the gap between academia and industry is widening. John, how do you see it, and what are you telling young people now who might be thinking about based in academia, who think about collaborating with industry?
Well, it's a real challenge. I mean, and yet, if we're not positive, we who've been privileged to be working in these areas and encourage them and help them to find ways to stay in the direction that they want to go for research, then we've really failed. I mean, the scene looks bleak, but those of us who watch, say, the NIH pattern of funding, it's been up and down, and one can only hope that it's not collapsing, that it's in a pause, and that the public awareness will save us. I remember many years ago when I was asked to go and consult for the MRC, I was thinking, what a beautiful system. They have university support in one side and direct support to investigators in another, and there wasn't so much political activity behind it. I now realize how fortunate we've been to live in a world in which there are many groups of citizens with diseases who go to those same congressmen and press hard for support for biomedical research. And I think we have to push every way we can to keep the public awareness up as to what it means for us to lose our edge in this field. We have so many areas that mean so much to everyone, not only from a point of view of human health and advancing knowledge, but also the economic power of the country depends on keeping one of these few things going. And therefore, I'm a great fan of academic industrial cooperation and trying to find ways to get the NIH mission back again. It can't collapse. Otherwise, we just can't allow that to happen. So I think we have to work with the young people particularly and say that it's happened before, it'll happen again, and we will support you.
Right. Well, this collaboration between NIH and industry kind of plays right into the next area of questioning that I want to direct to Chris. Chris, the NIH had set up the institute that you now run. A lot of kind of hope that this would foster interactions with industry. It's early days, but the first days were met by skepticism and maybe even some criticism. I think you were showing up saying to industry, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help you, and not everybody was opening doors, and academia was concerned that money was going to your institute instead of basic research. I think you've thought about that and maybe thought about where you need to go to really serve a role to advance the interests of patients as you began with, and maybe you would tell us a little bit more about that and the lessons learned and maybe best practices for this new era.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. And I think there's a couple of things to say about NCATS. First is that from a strictly financial point of view, because this has been an interest, NIH or NCATS, and those of you from pharma will know what I'm talking about here. NCATS was a reorg. There was no new money that went into NCATS. There were pieces that had been at NIH for up to 50 years and had been taken out and put from their ancestral homes and put into NCATS. So there was this interesting sort of urban legend that there was a massive shift in basic versus translation versus clinical research being done as a result of NCATS, and the data just don't support that. The purpose of NCATS really is to serve as an adapter, if you will, or a translator between the traditional and obviously essential fundamental basic research and what taxpayers and I can tell you congressmen are really interested in, which is what can you demonstrate to me has actually had an effect on my constituents. And I come from trained as a neurologist and on the clinical side, and on the basic side as a geneticist, and so my heart lies in fundamental research. However, my heart also lies in the patients with neurologic diseases that I could not treat and still couldn't. And I think addressing this problem, why it is that we have such great understanding sometimes, particularly in the neurological space, of fundamental mechanisms, and yet we are not able to intervene. Bert talked about that to some degree. And our approach to this is to say, well, there are two general areas that we want NCATS to work in. One is the general principles, the general problems which bedevil this translational process. Everything from target validation on the left side through the steps of preclinical development, predictive toxicology, predictive efficacy models, et cetera, de-risking models, all the way to what Rob was talking about, which is that even when a new therapeutic is developed, a new chemical entity or antibody, et cetera, getting that actually tested in an efficient and effective way in patients in this country is extraordinarily difficult. And even when that intervention makes it through regulatory approval, if it is an intervention that needs regulatory approval, getting it to the patients who need it, identifying those patients and getting those interventions to the patients that need them, and actually having an effect on human health is a whole nother step of so-called dissemination science. And NCATS works on that entire spectrum. Now, in the earlier stages, well, I guess one other thing to say is that as a general principle, I say over and over and over again that translation is a team sport. It's an obligatorily team sport. And having spent time at now 3 meccas, that is, I was at Harvard for about 15 years and trained at the MGH and did all those, and it was a fantastic experience, and then at Merck. And now in the government, it's very clear to me that none of these pieces of the infrastructure that we have has all of the appropriate knowledge, incentives, capital, and mission to be able to get where we want to go. However, if an organization approaches these problems in an obligatorily collaborative way, which NCATS does, then I think there's good reason to believe that even with static resources, and on the collapsing part, I hope that, to use a Bert Vogelstein analogy, I hope we are in G0, not in apoptotic development here. Because if we're collapsing, I got to look for a new job. And I really don't think that's the case. But the point is that that NCATS is designed to be a fundamentally different beast in the NIH ecosystem. It's designed to be this collaborative instrument that works with pharma and academia and nonprofits. On the pharma side, about 50% of the projects that we do are active collaborations with biotechs, pharmas, and venture capital organizations. And the reason we do those projects is not to work on general principles of translation, but rather to demonstrate in individual use cases a new approach to a translational problem, whether it's new chemistry or a new kind of toxicological evaluation or a new way to do a clinical trial. These are projects which are done on diseases which others don't work on, and there are many, many thousands of these diseases. But they're meant to be dual-use projects. They're projects which not only we hope develop an intervention, de-risk an intervention to the point where it will be attractive to a private sector organization for a neglected disease or a rare disease, but also tell us something about how to do the whole process better and then disseminate that information.
Chris, I think we'll move on, but thank you. I think the idea is that we've got a way of testing some new paradigms for speeding drug development and interfacing. Mike Brown, you've been highly collaborative, as you've mentioned, and I remember in the early days you not only collaborating, but prodding and instigating and getting us to move down the line, and which really was an enormous influence on the development of the statins. If you took that Mike Brown then and you transposed him to today, would it be harder or easier to accomplish what you did from a position in academia? And what do you see as a good way going forward?
Well, as I mentioned, Joe and I were intimately involved with Roy and the people at Merck during the earliest days of the development of statins. And, it was an interesting time, a different time. We didn't have any commercial interest in this. We never thought of starting a company or doing anything other than just advising the company and trying to help them go in the right direction. Nowadays, it's a little bit different. A lot of these arrangements, people start their own companies, and my university, for example, we cloned the enzyme HMG-CoA reductase, the gene for it, back in 1981. That is the target of statin drugs, and the later statins were all developed using our clone to produce an enzyme that they could test for inhibition. We never dreamed of patenting it in 1981. I don't think our university had a patent office in 1981. Now we're required by our employer, the University of Texas, to divulge every invention, and they decide whether they want to patent it or not. It's the same rule that one would have in a company. So universities have become much, much more commercially focused than they were. And again, this has advantages, there's no question. It has certain advantages, but it also, again, I'll go back to my original point. Of course, we need people working between academia and industry, but we also need some people in academia who don't give a damn about industry and are just trying to figure out how some basic process works.
Okay. Thanks. Rob, I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do, I visited your website, and you have an interesting comment on conflict of interest and where you see potential conflicts that perhaps other people don't see. And I wonder if you could comment on that for a moment.
Oh, which
Well, you've said that
I
you
have a
work
blog
for,
now, so there's no
you
telling
say you
what-
work for a $10 billion or $8 billion
that
health
one.
system, and
Yeah, so actually I was going to mention that because we talk about academia and industry, but I don't think most people realize what's happened to academia, and what Mike described was just a start. And I'm constantly in meetings where professors talk about industry like it's some evil thing, and my question is usually, what's the corporation that you work for? And when they think about it, let's take Hopkins, $8.5 billion per year revenue corporation. And let me tell you, if you want to get the wrath at Duke Health System, my employer, try proposing a study that might shut down the cath lab or reduce chemotherapy revenues by showing more appropriate use. So the environment has changed, and what used to be the ivory tower on the hill is now an integrated health system. And it's another thing I think most Americans are beginning to realize. Whether it's done through private enterprise or government, we're congealing into maybe 200 integrated health systems that are going to be competing at the level of $6 to $10 billion a year in revenue. Pitt is sort of the outlier here at $14 billion per year already. And they're all going to have an academic center in the middle because the currency is going to be mostly information that comes from the electronic records. So when people say academia versus industry, I say we have two industries. And the bigger one is actually not the medical products industry, it's actually the healthcare delivery industry, which has many of the same characteristics.
Good. Thank you. And I'm going to ask you a question and hope for a short answer. You do a lot of work at the interface with FDA. FDA is not represented on this panel, so I'm going to ask you if you might comment on what FDA could do to facilitate kind of stronger science and medicine while protecting the interests of patients.
Well, I mean, many of us in this room have been on panels that have recommended ways for Congress to help FDA be a more science-driven organization. But yeah, in my view, I think many of you know me, the FDA is full of public servants who work at a very low wage to try to make things better, and who, frankly, often are the last stronghold between someone who wants to make a lot of money and the public health. But they live in an environment where when they want to make a decision, every decision they make is going to make somebody mad, and everybody who's mad can go to a congressperson, and they're at the whim of all these congress people. So I actually think the solution lies more in a public pressure, just like what was described with the NIH, to help the FDA be more rational and to protect it from the whims of political pressures. And you wanted a short answer, I'll stop there, but there are ways to think about that.
Great, thanks. John, you were involved in creating one of the earliest and one of the most public partnerships between an academic institution and a company, the Herx Derangement at MGH. And I wonder if you can comment on lessons learned from that and how much of that could serve as a model going forward, or what needs to be done differently going forward.
Yeah, what Mike is referring to, and many of you know, is that some years ago, the Herx company, I think it was a total funding of about $85 million to the Mass General to establish a Department of Molecular Biology. And it was a generous, far-sighted operation which led to a remarkable result, most recently the Nobel Prize to Jack Szostak of that group. But the point is, we did get a great deal of criticism about it. And I remember there were congressional investigations. The MGH was selling out its rights achieved through public monies to a private company. Nobody bothered to actually look at the details of how it was done. So I think we stuck with it, and everyone now praises it, and it's a model that everyone would love to see replicated again, but probably won't happen. But it's led to, in fact, they were so generous, I don't know if people know this, they allowed them to reinvest the money that wasn't spent each year. So now it's got a very powerful endowment. And I saw a sad note when one of the founders of this effort came to me very recently, and Herx, as you know, disappeared. And he said, the only thing that's left of what I loved about Herx is the Department of Molecular Biology at the MGH, and I'm very grateful for it. And I think it's sad but true. And I think this is a model that may not be, as others have said, won't be done the same way. But this concept, I think the NIH has to be re-strengthened. These models have to be appreciated, and we have to have balance. And I think pharma scolds should be quieted in the process.
Right. Well, I'd like to maybe add a discordant note here. So we've got people, and I presume that much of the audience is very much in favor of the continuing exchange and collaboration between academia and industry, but not everybody sees it that way. And we know that there are loud voices that are really against the collaboration in any form. One of the recent ones that has caused great concern in some sectors is that ASCO, the American Society for Clinical Oncology, which is the largest oncology group in the world, professional society in the world, this spring announced a new policy in which they would ban industry scientists from presenting their original research at their annual meeting. And they also will ban industry scientists from publishing in their leading journal, the JCO, as either first author or senior author. Here we are kind of celebrating the collaboration, and this is a turn in a different direction. Mike Brown, you have views on this?
I certainly do. I think the demonization of the pharmaceutical industry in not only by these societies but by universities has gone to such a horrible extreme that our students, young people, are being taught that anything that comes out of industry is somehow corrupt. And it's cast a huge pall on the ability of pharmaceutical scientists to gain the respect that they deserve. How could you not allow companies to present the work, the achievements, the clinical data that they've generated? What's supposed to happen? It's just terrible. I think that disclosure is fine. But conflicts of interest abound. Rob just talked about how universities, every professor has a conflict of interest. Every paper that is published is one of the reasons is to advance the career of the senior scientist who publishes it. And there's no stronger conflict of interest than that. So conflicts of interest are all around us. We just have to recognize it. We have to teach our students to be critical of what they hear and to put it in perspective. But to say that one group is somehow evil and corrupt just because they work for a profit-making company, I think is horrible. And what it's done is it's really created this stigma. I used to be on the Pfizer board, and a university, a medical school dean called up and asked whether I would help them get a certain amount of money from Pfizer for translational research. And I pointed out to him that you've banned all of our people from your hospital and your campus. So what do you want us to do, stand outside and throw the money through the window? I mean, it's, this idea that you can't have a pen on your desk that happens to have the name of a drug on it or a company. We've just gone way, way, way too far, and it's terrible. It has ramifications way beyond just the fact at a particular meeting somebody can't present. It's creating an attitude of distrust that's, I think, terrible.
Thoughts by other panelists on this?
It's reached an extreme level that has to be fought back very strongly by a consortium of universities and leadership, as Francis Collins did before. In other words, reductio ad absurdum is the place to push back first, it seems to me.
I just say, go ahead.
I can't help but just note, the psychology of the gifts and the pens that you talk about. You ever go to Harvard and be offered a Harvard sweatshirt or a Harvard pen or a Duke basketball jersey when you're there? It's the same reason. It's to generate loyalty and enthusiasm and maybe a donation of money. So, but I do think while we're fighting back against the extremism, we do need to recognize that not-for-profit entities do have a different mission. It's how you put the two together that we just haven't gotten right. we need to keep working on it.
Well, you pointed out that not-for-profit, every medical center that has a hospital, yeah, they don't declare a profit at the end of the year. The reason is because they pay it out to all their physicians. The fact is, they are essentially profit-making, and they have a huge commercial. And you're the one who just pointed out that, you know, they're not about to abandon some of their very lucrative things.
Just one quick comment on that, because I probably live in this world about as much as any other academic with a research organization that I've run. I would just say that trying to make a margin and for-profit are really two different things, and I think we have to keep going back to what the criteria are that allow you to be not-for-profit. It doesn't mean that you can't make money. So I'm agreeing with you, but also there's a nuance here. I've always thought one of the great things about working with industry is there is no doubt what the primary motivator is. It's optimizing the financial state of the company within the rules of society, and that's a good thing. And I think it makes it a lot easier to make decisions. With academia, you never really know exactly which pocket they're going for.
Chris?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things about this, because this is a huge issue at NIH, and I have to say, I think a lot of these issues are things which are educational issues for our legislators and that you can really help with. So unfortunately, in my new job in the last year, I've had to spend an amazing amount of time down on Capitol Hill, which has been educational in all sorts of ways. And what you find is that there are urban legends there which legislators act on. And one of those is that any time an NIH organization gets involved with a profit-making organization, it is by definition corporate welfare. It's use of taxpayer dollars that are going to the development of a product that might make somebody money somewhere along the line, and they really believe that there is no place. For many of them do, and these are a lot of the fairly reasonable people, not the more extreme ends of the spectrum. These are very reasonable people who really believe that there needs to be a discontinuity between taxpayer research and for-profit research. And you don't see this any more starkly than an NIH intramural itself. So you probably know that 90% of the NIH budget goes to academic institutions, medical schools, et cetera. About 10% of it is spent right in Bethesda. And in about 6 or 7 years ago, essentially all contacts with for-profit organizations were rendered illegal, for which one can go to jail if you're caught going against these rules. And these are all the people who work at NIH. And so at the same time as the Congress is saying, gosh, we want interventions that improve human health, and those things are going to be products that almost always are going to have to, unless they're behavioral interventions, are going to have to go through the private sector. At the same time, these are the very people who are saying, oh no, you can't talk to any of these people. It's exactly the same thing as that we were just hearing. One of the things so what are we trying to do about this? So I am spending an awful lot of time down on Capitol Hill educating people about this, and I think we are making some headway. And I can't overestimate enough how important it is for you to get down there and talk about this. We are actively working with people at bio and at pharma and at the VC organizations to work with them on communication strategy, because I think it's something that NCATS really has to work on. And I think if we come at this with a common message, then I think we're much more likely to make headway.
Great. I think it's time to open this up for questions from the audience. Rob.
Hi, I'm Ron Cohen. I run a biotech company here in New York on the corner. This is, to me, one of the critical issues for the industry in our times. It is very difficult to make the kind of headway that you're all talking about and that Chris just articulated when, in a setting where many of the major academic opinion leaders and deans and presidents of medical schools and editors-in-chief of major medical and scientific publications have now taken up this mantle and regularly lambaste the industry every way they can. And it has become a relentless drumbeat. You can barely open up the New England Journal now without seeing some editorial or two or three lambasting industry and essentially casting industry as the black hats in the whole drama. To the points that the panel made earlier, it's a subversive and highly destructive cast of mind that has taken hold. By the way, I think industry has some responsibility for the attitudes that have developed, but what has not happened is that leaders who are of a different mind, of the mind that you articulated on the panel, have gotten together a consortium of other leading academics, together with leading industry people, together with the industry representatives and so forth, and leading government advocates, to form a consortium and a think tank and really put together a counter effort, an equally relentless counter effort to educate Congress, the President, the public, the media, and let's not forget the media outlets as well. And I think that's what's missing. It's all being done piecemeal, but that has very limited effectiveness unless we can get everyone together.
Interesting ideas,
I
comments?
want to just point out that the New England Journal had a wonderful editorial by Jeff Drazen. On the other hand, I mean, everything isn't bleak. And while we worry about things, we mustn't become so depressed that the people we want to bring into the field get turned away, they don't understand it. So, but, Drazen's editorial, Trust the Evidence, was a very nice counter to some of this.
Yes.
I guess I would just say a couple things. One is that what I see is that in an era of limiting resources, what people tend to do is claim that they are the ones who are most important. And there's two ways you can do that. Either you can raise yourself or you can diss somebody else. And I see this happening all the time. And that there are, and we know who these people are, they're academic folks, and some of them are folks I know quite well, that they actually have made a career doing this, and it's actually a very good career.
Lucrative. The books sell like hotcakes.
You better believe it. So this you do what you have to pay your mortgage.
Chris, keep doing what you're doing.
There is another industry that went through the same thing. This is Peter Young from Young Partners. There's another industry went through the same thing in a very serious state, and that was the Chem Plastics industry. And if you go back, the industry was really trashed by every group possible. The one thing I ask is whether people think about how that industry turned things around. The American Plastic Council basically mounted a campaign, a marketing campaign, advertising that just basically emphasized two things. One is the importance of plastics, which we all know is important. But the other is the effort that the industry had been embarking on for recycling, so forth, dramatically turned around public opinion. Today, if you compare what people feel about plastics versus 20, 30 years ago, dramatically different. So the question is there any effort? There's two things. One is the industry might look at that example and say, okay, here's one example of how it worked on relatively modest funds, but the others, is anything happening that will do something similar, right?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot happening. We have actual parameters in which we can measure reputation, and we're following it. But I'm not sure that advertising is the answer. I tell my colleagues I think there are two things we can do, and that is every day we're each confronted by decisions, and we need to do the right thing. And probably the biggest thing that we can do as an industry is introduce these breakthrough drugs that really change the lives of patients and their families. Imagine if an Alzheimer's drug actually makes it across the finish line, what the impact will be, and what that'll do to, if we get the message out correctly, to the regard with which we're held by the people who are impacted by it. So I would strongly favor that over any kind of media campaign.
But I do think that it is going to be important to get some appropriate messaging here, because one of the things that shocked me a few years ago when I looked at the latest poll of who in the American population thinks makes the drugs that are on the market. Do you know the answer to this question?
You.
NIH. Yes,
Yeah.
they by overwhelming margin, and which was news to me. I got to tell you, I spent 10 years there, and
All right. My former boss has a question.
I think a couple of comments. First, the industry has made some errors, and I think that it's evident that those errors have increased with time and pressures, and so that has to be corrected. Number one, I mean, let's admit it. Some errors have been made, and that has sort of sullied the atmosphere, and so we've got to cut that out. So number one, let's clean up the shop. Secondly, if we look to see what is missing in Alzheimer's disease or cancers, as we heard this morning, there's not translation. It really isn't. We're not lacking in translation, in my view, because when there is an obvious new mechanism that becomes clear scientifically, then there are tons of funds that get poured into it. Look at PD-1 now that we heard earlier, and we know. There's no shortage of translational money. What there is shortage of is new ideas, and that comes from basic research. And that's what has been suffering. That's what our new graduate students and our potential graduate students hear about, difficulty in getting grants, the average age of getting a first grant, the difficulty of senior investigators renewing their grants. This is the problem in this country, and let's not fool ourselves.
I got to disagree. I agree with point one, that the most important thing is new ideas, but although there may be a lot of money in translation, we are really piss poor at translation. Your country is last in economically developed countries in the health of its population. So we're inventing drugs that other countries are translating into better health, and we're not. And if we don't acknowledge that and talk about it, we're going to continue to deteriorate as a country.
Are we talking about healthcare delivery, or, I mean, that's different than anything else we've been talking about.
If you want to believe it's different, go on believing that. But the things are very closely related. If you develop a statin and no one gets it,
Well, that's marketing, but
no.
companies do
It's
that really,
information.
companies do that really, really
Yeah,
well.
and I-
So if they were so good, we wouldn't be 18.
yeah. But I guess
Companies are a reason why we.
I guess I would say both people, right? I mean, from where I sit, you know these numbers. There's 7,000 diseases that affect the human family. Of those, 500 have any treatment. And if you look at how many nobody works on, the answer is about 5,000. And those are, if you are somebody who has one of those disorders, you're out of luck. And they're low prevalence disorders. They're even when the defects are understood, there are just not the incentives out there. And companies would love to work on these, but you just can't make a return on investment. And so there is a need in that space. There's also obviously a need for efficiency. Any process that fails 99.9% of the time has to be said is not optimized, and that's the therapeutic development process. Let's be honest. And so there are fundamental things that we don't understand about this process. The whole therapeutic development process is remarkably empirical. Whether you think about
It's fascinating. We've been having these same arguments for 25 years. Those of us who disagreed 25 years ago still disagree. But the one thing we do agree on, I think, is we've got to come up with an effective set of messages that are done jointly, but without whitewashing the errors that Dr.
I
Angelo
agree,
has referred
and
to.
with that, I would say that just as industry here asked academia to help explain its case, I think industry needs to be very strong advocates for the NIH budget. Needs to be a very loud voice for that, both for the sake of our patients and our own industry. So I'm going to summarize by saying I think we've heard kind of universal support for collaborations. There have been problems that have been pointed out, pitfalls, but I think the basic premise here is that innovation comes from this interface, from an active exchange at this interface. There are distinctions between the for-profit and the not-for-profit world. Some of them are blurred, some of them are very clear. I think in these panelists we have embodied some real examples of how to do it right. And I thank all of you for coming and for your support and for the organizers of the Galien Forum. Thank you very much.